Dr. Laura Hambly-Lovett is an organizational psychologist, professional speaker, business leader, author, and podcast host of the highly acclaimed podcast, Where Work Meets Life. She's a thought leader on workplace psychology, the future of work and career development, with nearly 25 years of experience. Dr. Laura is passionate about creating cultures that attract top talent and where people stay and thrive. Dr. Laura has founded several psychology and consulting practices, including Canada Career Counseling in 2009, where registered psychologists help thousands of Canadians navigate their career and workplace challenges, and support organizations with leadership and culture development. She holds a PhD in industrial organizational psychology from the University of Calgary, where she is currently an adjunct professor. She's received a Canadian Women of Inspiration Award as a global influencer in 2018. Now, she is going to come and deliver her talk titled Stop Toxic Bosses. Without any further ado, I would like to introduce Dr. Laura to the stage.
Toxic bosses kill people, starting with their mental well-being, their spirit, their confidence, then moving on to their physical health, raising their blood pressure or wrecking their gut. How many of you or one of your loved ones have worked for a toxic boss? Show of hands. Wow, look at all those hands. What are toxic bosses anyway? Toxic bosses are in positions of great responsibility. They are leading human beings. And they may be at any level of an organization, from a supervisor all the way to the CEO. But one thing they all have in common is their ongoing behaviors that hurt people's engagement, productivity, and well-being. Toxic bosses root themselves deeply in organizations, so deeply that they kill the culture. And they often kill the culture silently, like weeds wrecking a garden. Toxic bosses are causing major harm, and we must identify their personas to expose and disarm them. For the past 25 years, I've researched leadership, and I've worked with thousands of employees and leaders across industries and across North America, and I've seen the same patterns happening over and over. And with our clients at Canada Career Counseling, since the pandemic, I had been seeing more and more toxic boss behaviors and stories that were impacting our clients. So I decided to do research across North America on this topic. And I'm on a mission to shine a light on the harm that toxic bosses are doing. Which brings me to 3 grounded truths that I'm going to share with you tonight about the damage that toxic bosses are doing and what we can do to expose and disarm them. Grounded truth number 1, toxic bosses are causing major damage and are far more common than we think. Toxic bosses are a global issue. They are all over the world. And people are feeling frustrated and disillusioned that these bosses are allowed to stay in their roles. And I call them bosses, not leaders, because a true leader brings out the best in their people, while a toxic boss degrades and depletes them. Toxic bosses can be in any industry, and no one industry is immune from toxic bosses. You may be surprised to know that 87% of professionals have reported to a toxic boss, and 30% have reported to more than one. I'm in that category, and I've been an entrepreneur most of my career. And a quarter of people say they're working for the worst boss that they've ever had. That equates to 44 million North Americans. That's not good. And almost 50% of people say, I've quit a job because of a toxic boss. And when we're talking economics, which Todd knows better than me, that equates to billions of dollars every year in loss of talent. The cost of turnover is huge. Some estimates show $100 billion or more a year in North America due to toxic leadership. And how do they do this harm? They do it through their overt and covert behaviors. Overt behaviors are the obvious ones, like bullying and harassing, whereas covert behaviors are sneaky and silent and manipulative, like a slippery snake in the grass. Terrible. I'm going to tell you a story about Jessie. I'm going to call her Jessie. I interviewed Jessie on her story. She was in HR in the tech industry, and she was doing well. She was thriving in her career. She was a high achiever, until one day she found herself reporting to a toxic boss. The toxic boss was a narcissist and a control freak, and the abusive behaviors got worse and worse over time, until Jessie's stress just reached a peak, and she could no longer take it. And one day she found herself in her boss's office and suffered a panic attack. Right there and then, she had to immediately begin a medical leave. And it was on that medical leave that Jessie realized the extent of physical and psychological damage she had endured from that toxic boss. Suffice it to say, there are way too many stories like Jessie's. And I'm going to share the end of Jessie's story in a little bit with you. But these toxic bosses are doing major harm. And it's not just one bad apple. There are way too many bad apples across industries, across public organizations. I see them in government. I see them even in nonprofits. Toxic bosses exist. And then I see them in businesses, from a small business all the way to a global enterprise. Toxic bosses lurk, and they do their damage. Which is why, once we know how prevalent they are, we need to understand how did they do the damage they do. Which brings me to grounded truth number 2. Identifying the 8 personas of a toxic boss is the first step to stop them. So along with my talented team of university students, some of which are here tonight, and I appreciate them, one of the greatest joys in my job is mentoring university psychology students. But a couple of years ago, we started to research toxic leadership in North America. And it was Renee Pai and I at first, and Renee Pai has a mic tonight to be passing around for questions. But Renee and I interviewed toxic boss survivors across industries, and we heard so many stories that would blow your mind. And we also went on, my team of researchers, to do surveys across North America. And we identified hundreds of behaviors that were happening with toxic bosses. And as an organizational psychologist, you have all this data, and you need to make it easy to understand and apply to people. So I categorized it into the 8 personas of a toxic boss, and I made them memorable. And here they are. 2 of them are your signature cocktails tonight. How many of you have tried the dishonest manipulator? Show of hands. Yes, yes, I can see your cheeks look rosy. How many of you have experienced the gaslighter? Yes, there's more hands. Awesome. And because it's dry January for some, I made a signature mocktail. I didn't make it. I requested the control freak. How many of you have tried that? Awesome. So, all kidding aside, this is a serious issue. These personas are doing major damage. All 8 personas. And most toxic bosses have several of these personas going on at once. And in the book, I have checklists to help you identify which of the 8 personas you might be dealing with. I also have stories of each persona from real toxic boss survivors across industries, you name it, Wall Street, Hollywood, energy industry, banking, whatever industry, we've got stories, anonymous stories, of course. And these stories include my own story from 20 years ago when I joined a consulting firm. I had finished my PhD, finished my first maternity leave, and I was excited to start with a consulting firm until I found myself under a toxic boss. She was a narcissist, a control freak, and had a healthy dose of abusive a-hole. I later learned she was known as the ice queen in our industry. And yes, she was icy cold, but before she could damage my self-confidence, I was able to quit. I was able to quit after 8 weeks. But it felt like a long 8 weeks. But I quit, and not many people have that same ability to quit. Because when you find yourself under a toxic boss, oftentimes you're further along within a job, and a toxic boss comes along, and you're financially dependent on that job. Maybe you have pension built up, stock options, long-term incentives, or the economy sucks and you can't just quit. So you feel like you're caged. You're caged like that cage on my book. And it's very difficult. And you decide, I'm just going to try to impress this toxic boss, and maybe if I impress them, they'll treat me better. And instead, it gets worse over time. That's what toxic bosses are like. It gets worse over time. And then you decide, I'll report it to HR, but then you get terrified. If I report it to HR, I might lose my job. And this is the stories we're hearing over and over. But in the book, and based on all the research, there's actually 6 options that people have when it comes to dealing with a toxic boss. And quitting or staying are just 2 of those 6 options. So I'm giving people hope and getting them back into the driver's seat of their career. Because once we understand what is happening to us, we need to understand how the heck we can stop toxic bosses, because silence protects toxic bosses while bringing their behaviors to light, exposes, and disarms them. Grounded truth number 3. Let's go back to the Me Too movement of 2017. Me Too uncovered widespread abuse of power in organizations. Abuse of power in the form of sexual assault and harassment of women at work. The Me Too movement brought up a widespread conversation about this abuse of power. Likewise, toxic bosses are a widespread abuse of power out there in today's organizations. And they're not gender specific. In fact, a woman is just as likely to be a toxic boss as a man. There are 2 things that need to happen when it comes to stopping toxic bosses. We need awareness, which we're doing by talking about it tonight, by identifying the 8 personas, my book. And we need widespread conversation about the damage toxic bosses are doing. We need conversation in our families, with our friends, in our workplaces. And organizations need to do a better job of this. We need to have more care, curiosity, and courage when it comes to toxic bosses. Care is about caring for people, yourself and others who may be suffering under a toxic boss, because it is brutal and it can leave you traumatized. We need curiosity. Curiosity to ask the questions about who are we hiring and who are we promoting into people leadership roles, which are positions of great responsibility. Being very careful about who we are putting into those roles, and know that toxic bosses are great at selling themselves. We need to also be curious about how our leaders are doing. What are they like as a manager? How are the people who are reporting to them doing? And there are ways to ask the questions in a psychologically safe way where people are protected and they don't have the fear of losing their job. So there are ways to do this, but we got to have the curiosity to get the information. And then once we find that there's a toxic boss lurking, and it may be through exit interviews, you're getting turnover happening again and again. Exit interviews are not just a checklist for HR. They're a gold mine of data. But we got to have the courage to say, there's something going on with that leader. We need to do something about that. And we need to act swiftly and with courage. We need to act with courage to create psychologically safe workplaces where this can be dealt with and it's not tolerated. Such is the case with a college director I interviewed. She explained when their notoriously toxic boss was finally let go, it was like the windows opened and the negative energy left. A siege and then a purge for many people. And once again, this team could come to work and not walk on eggshells. They began to develop trust. They were once again able to collaborate and not be scared every single day. And they brought their best selves to work because it was psychologically safe once again. Back to the story of Jessie. Jessie, who suffered a panic attack in her boss's office. Can you imagine? Jessie is now thriving. She had care, curiosity, and courage when it came to that medical leave. She got the care she needed from loved ones and friends. And she had the curiosity to look into what she might need to heal. She got therapy. She worked on her physical health. She got herself back into seated positions so she could once again drive the car of her own career. And she had the courage to enter into the workplace again and build trust again. And now she's an entrepreneur in the HR industry and thriving. But there are far too many stories like Jessie. Talented professionals fall prey to a toxic boss. And that needs to stop. So once we bring these three grounded truths together, a bigger message is revealed. Toxic bosses are doing major damage. We must identify their personas to expose and disarm them. Earlier, I said toxic bosses kill people. But once we can name what's happening, the power dynamic shifts, and we can build confidence and well-being and get back into the driver's seat of our own career. And these three grounded truths have become undeniable. Toxic bosses are causing major damage. We need to identify their 8 personas to expose and disarm them, and silence protects toxic bosses, while bringing their behaviors to light is what we need to do. I'm hoping that I can help people around the world with navigating, escaping, and recovering from toxic bosses. I'm shining a light on this issue. And I want people to have a language so that they can better help themselves and others who may be suffering under a toxic boss. And I want people to no longer feel helpless in a toxic workplace. And this is the final thought I want to leave you with tonight. Toxicity spreads in silence, and awareness is how we stop it from taking root and killing people. Let's #StopToxicBosses.